This is time for healing from the damage caused by a narcissist. Have you ever feel that strange, disorienting quiet after everything finally stops? The arguments, the emotional storms, the endless tension, yet the pain inside you refuses to fade. Many survivors of narcissistic abuse describe this moment with unsettling precision. The messages no longer arrive. The narcissist may be physically absent, and on the surface life appears calmer. But internally, something still feels raw, fractured, and unfinished. Psychologists explain that this stage is often more frightening than the abuse itself because it marks the transition from survival to healing. During the relationship, your nervous system had a constant threat to respond to. Now, for the first time, there is no immediate danger, only you, your body, and psychological wounds that were never allowed to be seen, named, or processed. From a psychological standpoint, healing from narcissistic abuse is not about moving on or erasing the past. It is about repairing a nervous system that was forced to adapt to chronic emotional danger. While the abuse was ongoing, both mind and body developed survival patterns, hypervigilance, self-suppression, emotional numbing to protect you from ongoing harm. Psychologists emphasize that healing asks these systems to unlearn what once kept you safe. That process can feel slow and uncomfortable because it requires compassion rather than urgency, patience rather than pressure, and understanding rather than self-judgment. Many survivors are unprepared for how overwhelming healing feels at first. Instead of relief, they experience exhaustion, emptiness, or even emotional collapse. Clinically, this response occurs because the nervous system has been operating in long-term survival mode. During the abusive relationship, stress hormones such as cortisol and adrenaline were constantly released to keep you alert, compliant, and ready to respond. Once the threat disappears, those chemicals drop suddenly. Psychologists describe this as a delayed emotional release, where feelings that were postponed for survival finally surface all at once. The body is no longer bracing for impact, and the mind is no longer suppressing pain. For the narcissist, emotional intensity served a regulatory function. Conflict, control, and dominance temporarily stabilized their fragile sense of self. For the victim, that same intensity required constant self-monitoring and emotional suppression. When the relationship ends, the narcissist often seeks a new source of validation to restore their internal balance. The survivor, however, is left with the psychological aftermath, finally feeling grief, fear, and exhaustion that could not be processed earlier. Psychologists stress that this imbalance explains why the aftermath feels so heavy. One system avoided feeling, while the other absorbed everything. Healing begins when survivors understand that this emotional crash is not a sign of weakness. It is the nervous system finally exhaling after holding its breath for too long. From a therapeutic perspective, the most protective strategy at this stage is not forcing positivity or productivity, but allowing rest, emotional honesty, and safety without judgment. The body needs permission to slow down before it can rebuild. One of the most unexpected aspects of healing is grief, deep, complex, and often confusing. Survivors grieve not only the relationship, but also the person they were before the abuse and the future they believed they were building. Psychologists explain that narcissistic relationships are structured around illusion and intermittent hope. The bond was formed not just with a person, but with a promise, one that was repeatedly offered and withdrawn. This cycle creates emotional investment that is difficult to release, even after the truth becomes clear. For the narcissist, maintaining illusion supports ego stability and control. For the victim, believing in that promise provided meaning and motivation to endure pain. When reality finally replaces fantasy, the loss can feel devastating. This grief often brings intense self-blame. Why did I stay? Why did I believe them? Clinically, psychologists view this self-blame as an attempt to regain control. The mind prefers the narrative, "I made a mistake," over the more frightening truth, "I was manipulated during vulnerability." Healing requires reframing this story with compassion and accuracy. You did not fail. You adapted to psychological coercion. Allowing grief without attacking yourself is a crucial protective strategy. Mourning is not regression. It is evidence that the psyche is integrating reality instead of denying it. Psychologists emphasize that unexpressed grief prolongs trauma, while acknowledged grief transforms it. Another deep wound that surfaces during healing is the loss of self-trust after gaslighting. Survivors often say, "I don't trust my judgment anymore," and this fear is not irrational. Repeated reality distortion trains the brain to doubt its own perceptions. Over time, internal authority is replaced by external validation, leaving the survivor unsure of what is real. For the narcissist, gaslighting preserves dominance and avoids accountability. For the victim, it fractures identity and undermines decision-making capacity. Rebuilding self-trust is not accomplished by forcing confidence or silencing doubt. Psychologists explain that it is rebuilt through small, consistent acts of self-validation, writing down experiences, naming emotions without minimizing them, and making low-risk decisions independently all strengthen neural pathways associated with internal authority. Each time you honor your perception, the brain learns that it is safe to trust itself again. This process feels slow because it is meant to be slow. You are not simply gaining confidence. You are reconstructing a psychological foundation that was deliberately dismantled. And with patience, repetition, and support, that foundation can become even stronger than it was before. As healing continues, many survivors begin to notice a subtle but profound shift in how they relate to their own bodies. Psychologists explain that when the body keeps reacting even in safety, it is not betraying you. It is protecting you based on outdated information. Trauma is stored not as a narrative, but as sensation. The nervous system encoded unpredictability as danger because in the abusive environment, that association was accurate. For the narcissist, unpredictability functioned as leverage, keeping the victim emotionally off balance and easier to control. For the survivor, this meant living in a state of constant alertness. Even after the threat is gone, the body continues to scan for danger, responding to tone changes, silence, or stress as if abuse could return at any moment. Understanding this reframes bodily reactions from "something is wrong with me" to "my body learned this to keep me alive." Psychologists emphasize that this is why healing cannot rely on insight alone. Talking about trauma helps the mind, but the body requires experiential evidence of safety. Somatic therapies, grounding practices, gentle movement, breath regulation, and consistent daily routines all work by sending repeated signals to the nervous system that the environment is stable and predictable. For the narcissist, bodily regulation was never the goal. Emotional chaos maintained control. For the survivor, re-regulation becomes an act of reclaiming autonomy. Over time, these practices weaken the survival circuits and strengthen pathways associated with rest, connection, and internal safety. The body learns slowly and gently that it no longer has to brace for impact. As this bodily safety increases, anger often begins to surface, and many survivors find this deeply unsettling. Psychologists note that anger emerging during recovery is not a setback. It is a sign that the psyche is regaining integrity. Anger is a boundary emotion, arising when a person recognizes that a line was crossed. During the abusive relationship, anger was dangerous. Expressing it led to punishment, withdrawal, or escalation. Suppressing it became a survival strategy. For the narcissist, anger was often weaponized outward, used to dominate or intimidate. For the victim, anger was turned inward or silenced entirely. When anger finally appears in healing, It signals that the nervous system no longer believes silence is required to survive. This does not mean the survivor wants revenge or conflict. It means the self is waking up. Psychologists encourage survivors to approach anger with curiosity rather than fear. Healthy anger does not require explosive expression. It can be processed through therapy, writing, movement, or creative outlets. Used skillfully, anger becomes information. It clarifies values, highlights boundaries, and supports self-protection rather than self-destruction. With anger often comes the slow reclamation of identity. Narcissistic abuse erodes individuality so gradually that many survivors only recognize the loss after the relationship ends. Preferences were mocked, needs dismissed, and authenticity punished. Over time, the victim learned to become whatever minimized conflict. Psychologists describe this as self-abandonment under threat, an adaptive response to emotional danger, not a personality flaw. For the narcissist, a diminished partner feels less threatening and more controllable. For the survivor, this adaptation results in a painful sense of emptiness and disorientation. Healing identity does not mean returning to who you were before the abuse. Psychologists emphasize that recovery is about discovering who you are now without fear. This process involves gentle experimentation, noticing what brings calm instead of approval, exploring interests without judgment, and allowing opinions to exist without explanation. The narcissist needed you small in order to feel large. Healing allows you to take up space again, quietly, steadily, and without apology. Identity returns not through force, but through permission. As identity strengthens, boundaries become clearer, and this is where no contact or low contact strategies often become essential. From a psychological standpoint, continued exposure to a narcissist, even minimal, can reignite trauma responses. The brain associates their presence with confusion and threat, activating old neural pathways. For the narcissist, continued access maintains emotional supply and the illusion of control. For the survivor, distance allows those pathways to weaken while new ones form. When survivors finally begin to heal, many are alarmed by the nonlinear nature of recovery. One day brings clarity and empowerment, the next brings doubt, sadness, or longing. Clinicians explain that this fluctuation reflects neural reorganization. The brain is unlearning survival-based pathways while forming new ones centered on autonomy and safety. Emotional regression during healing does not signal failure. It signals integration. For the narcissist, emotional inconsistency in the victim often triggers renewed attempts at control. For the survivor, understanding this dynamic helps protect against re-engagement and self-blame. Therapeutic work during this phase focuses on restoring internal authority, processing emotions that were previously unsafe to feel, and learning boundaries that do not require justification. Grief also becomes an inevitable companion in this stage of recovery. Survivors are not only mourning the relationship, but the version of themselves that existed before survival became their primary task. Psychologists view this grief as a healthy reckoning with reality. It honors what was lost without denying what was endured. Allowing this mourning process, rather than rushing toward positivity, helps the psyche integrate the experience into a coherent narrative, reducing the risk of repetition or unresolved trauma. Ultimately, the psychological truth is clear. Narcissistic abuse is not merely an emotional injury. It is a comprehensive assault on the nervous system, identity, and physical health. The changes it causes are real because the threat was real, but equally real is the capacity for recovery. With education, trauma-informed support, and patient self-attunement, survivors can rebuild trust in their perceptions, safety in their bodies, and continuity in their sense of self. You were never broken by the abuse. You were overwhelmed by a system designed to erode you. Healing is not a return to who you once were, untouched and unscarred. It is the emergence of someone wiser, more embodied, and finally free, not just outside the narcissist's reach, but inside their own mind and body.